All right, buckle up because we're about to strap this woke snowflake, Garrett, onto the world's most uncomfortable comedy roller coaster. Kill Tony, the show where fragile egos go to die. The crowd at the Vulcan Gas Company was amped up, drunk, and ready for blood. Tony Hinchcliffe was on stage, looking like the love child of a used car salesman and a serial killer, with that grin that says he's about to ruin someone's day. The band was jamming out something that sounded like a rock version of a clown funeral, and the energy was electric. Tony grabs the mic like he's about to strangle it, leans in, and says, "All right, let's see what kind of pathetic losers the comedy gods have blessed us with tonight." The audience howls in anticipation because they're a bunch of savages who feed on the souls of the unprepared. Tony reaches into the bucket, pulls out a name, and reads, Garret. From the back, a vision of hipster confusion emerges. Garret strolls up to the stage like he's walking into a gender-neutral, gluten-free, organic coffee shop. The dude's got a purple ponytail so tight it looks like it's holding onto his last shred of masculinity. Black leather jacket clinging to his scrawny frame like it's trying to escape from being seen with him. This guy looks like a hot topic threw up all over a yoga instructor. The second he steps up, you can practically hear Tony's eyes roll into the back of his skull. "All right, Garret, you've got 60 seconds. Make it funny," Tony says, already looking like he's mentally writing the roast for this dude's eulogy. Garret grabs the mic, clears his throat, and starts his set. So, isn't it funny how white comedians think they can just, make fun of minorities? I mean, where's the social responsibility in that? It's like totally punching down, you know? The audience collectively sighs, half of them already checking their phones. Garrett's voice has the energy of a half-deflated balloon, and his punchlines land with the grace of a pigeon slamming into a window. He keeps going, oblivious to the hostile stares. And, I don't get why everyone loves this show, Kill Tony. It's just, mean for no reason. Comedy should be about uplifting people, not tearing them down. You can practically hear Tony's erection deflate. The audience is ready to eat this guy alive, but they're waiting for Tony to throw the first punch. Garret finishes his set to the kind of silence usually reserved for funerals and AA meetings. Tony grabs the mic, smirking like a hyena that just spotted a limping gazelle. "All right, Garret, that was something. You're the first person to ever walk on this stage and simultaneously kill comedy and my will to live. You got any hobbies besides making sure nobody else has fun?" Garret blinks, confused. I advocate for social justice, and I think comedians should be, mindful of their impact on marginalized communities." Tony's grin grows wider. "Oh, sweet Christ, we got ourselves a woke warrior. Look, Garret, I hate to break it to you, but comedy is about punching everyone. If you don't get punched, it's because you're not interesting enough to be worth the effort." The crowd explodes into laughter, and Garrett's purple ponytail visibly wilts. "Let me get this straight," Tony continues, pacing around him like a predator. "You came on a show known for roasting people and then cried about it like a vegan at a barbecue? What did you expect, Garret? A safe space with emotional support puppies backstage?" Garret starts to stammer. "Well, I just think comedy should be, kind and uplifting." Tony cuts him off. "Comedy isn't kind, you numb-nutted clit whisperer. Comedy is like prison. If you drop the soap, everyone's gonna rail you, and if you can't handle that, then maybe stick to your TikTok therapy videos where you cry about microaggressions." The band starts playing a little riff, adding to the humiliation like they're scoring a gladiator fight. But Tony isn't done. He's just getting warmed up. "And what the fuck is up with the purple ponytail, Garret? You look like a My Little Pony cosplayer who got lost on the way to his OnlyFans photo shoot. I can smell the soy milk radiating off you, man. Do you just sit at home, sniffing your own farts, writing angry tweets about how Joe Rogan is ruining society?" The audience loses it. Garrett's face turns the same shade as his hair, which is impressive considering it looks like he dyes it with Barney's blood. Oh, and let's talk about your leather jacket. You know it's made from cows, right? Or did you think it came from the free-range, grass-fed BDSM section at Whole Foods? Garret, on the verge of tears, finally tries to defend himself. I just think that comedy can be used to, spread positivity and..." Tony interrupts. "Positivity? You came to the wrong place, you fucking rainbow farting unicorn. We're here to break dreams, not hug it out like we're at a feminist poetry reading. Newsflash, Garret. Nobody gives a shit about your moral compass. This is comedy, not a fucking TED Talk. The audience is practically in tears. Garrett's shoulders slump, his eyes glazed over, as if he just realized the world is a cold, unfeeling bitch. Red Band jumps in. Hey, Garret, can we just skip to the part where you storm off stage, crying, and write an angry blog post about how mean we are? That way, we can get back to the funny people. The crowd erupts. Garret takes the walk of shame off the stage, looking like he just discovered Santa isn't real, and his parents have been lying to him his whole life. Tony watches him go, shaking his head. All right, let's keep this shit show moving. Up next, maybe we'll get someone with actual balls, or at least a functioning sense of humor. And just like that, Garret became another Kill Tony casualty, a social justice warrior who brought a purple ponytail to a fucking gunfight. The moral of the story? If you can't take a joke, maybe stay home, sip on your kale smoothie, and leave comedy to the adults. Garret stood there, his purple ponytail now sagging like a sad balloon that had been deflated by the cold, hard truth. His skin was flushed, his body stiff, like a deer caught in headlights. Except this deer was wearing a leather jacket that made him look like a bad extra in a goth porno. The crowd was still roasting him, feeding off his suffering like vampires in a blood bank. They were loving every second of his humiliation, and Garrett's face looked like he was stuck in a permanent cringe loop, each second feeling like an eternity of watching his self-worth disintegrate in real time. Tony wasn't done yet. He wasn't about to let this guy get away without feeling the full, unrelenting weight of his comedic wrath. He leaned in, his voice dripping with sarcasm and glee like he was savoring a deep-fried victory. Garret, I gotta give it to you, man. You really came up here and showed us what it's like to have zero self-awareness. Honestly, you should be proud. You've got the charisma of a wet fart, and that purple hair makes you look like the lead singer of a band called Emotional Turmoil, a band no one would pay to see, even if they were giving out free meth at the door. You're so fucking clueless. You probably think an apology letter can fix climate change. Huh? The audience was eating it up. Some people almost doubled over with laughter, wiping tears from their eyes as if they'd just watched their least favorite high school teacher slip on a banana peel and break his neck. Garret, poor bastard, wasn't sure if he should try to defend himself or just end it all right there. But of course, Tony wasn't giving him an out. Not yet. You know what your problem is, Garret? Tony continued, the smirk on his face widening like a shark about to feast on a fresh kill. You've got the personality of a cardboard cutout of Ellen that got left out in the rain. You think you're out here fighting for justice, but you're just a walking, talking Tumblr thread full of trigger warnings and fragile feelings. How the hell do you even walk around without your own personal safe space? Do you have a safety blanket that says, we're all good here, Garret? Everything's fine? Nothing is going to challenge you? The audience couldn't contain themselves anymore, cackling like a bunch of drunken hyenas watching a gazelle get mauled. Garret's face twisted like he was caught in a windstorm of shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, choking him like a bad taco. You see, Tony went on, completely uncaring for whatever emotional wreckage Garret was now becoming. What you don't understand, Garret, is that comedy isn't supposed to make people comfortable. You're so caught up in your little bubble of progressive bullshit that you don't even realize you've become the joke. You think you're some kind of activist, but you're just a fucking clown. You're like a vegan who gets offended when someone mentions bacon and then they make it their whole personality. You're over here talking about punching down, but all I hear is the sound of you getting flattened by a truck of reality. Garret winced, as if he had been slapped across the face with a wet towel filled with disappointment. His hands started shaking, and it wasn't the kind of shake you get from excitement or adrenaline. No, this was pure fear. He wasn't ready for this. Nobody could have prepared him for this kind of destruction. Tony was turning him into a punchline, and Garret wasn't even getting a say in the matter. He was just along for the ride, like a toddler in the back seat of a car that's been hijacked by an angry, bitter comedian who has zero fucks left to give. The band kicked in with a sarcastic riff, and Tony took full advantage of the moment. You know, Garrett, I gotta say, you remind me of the people who are always so woke, they can't even tell when they've crossed into full-blown stupidity. You probably think that cancel culture is some kind of magical spell that makes everyone say sorry, like you're casting a spell from Harry Potter to stop all the bad jokes. What are you gonna do, Garrett? Walk up to Dave Chappelle and tell him that his whole career is offensive to your personal brand of delicate snowflake humor? The crowd went wild, the laughter booming so loud it rattled the windows. Garrett's face was now the color of a tomato in a blender, and his whole body trembled like a jackrabbit about to be gunned down in the woods. He was stuck, frozen on stage, his pride unraveling faster than his ability to speak. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like a fish that had just realized it was drowning on dry land. Tony wasn't finished. He couldn't resist. You ever wonder why no one ever takes you seriously, Garrett? You're out here wearing a leather jacket like you're the Fonz or some shit, but you're really just the kid in high school who wore a leather jacket to hide the fact that he still had a body pillow of a cartoon character. You're out here trying to lecture us on comedy, but your idea of a good time is probably getting offended by SpongeBob because Garrett stood there, his purple ponytail now sagging like a sad balloon that had been deflated by the cold, hard truth. His skin was flushed, his body stiff like a deer caught in headlights. Except this deer. Garrett stumbled off stage, his dignity shattered like a plate thrown against the wall, the shards of his self-respect scattered across the Kill Tony studio. He wasn't sure if he wanted to crawl into a hole and die or find the nearest exit and disappear into the darkness. All he knew was that his purple ponytail was the least of his worries now. He was walking a fine line between wanting to laugh at the absurdity of his existence and curl into a fetal position, sucking his thumb for comfort. Backstage, Garrett tried to steady his breathing, his hands still shaking like he'd been electrocuted by a live wire. The only thing keeping him upright was the constant drip of regret pouring into his soul. He could hear the laughter and the clinking of drinks from the bar, but it felt like the sound was coming from a distance, as if he had already transcended into another realm, a place where comedians laughed at him from the afterlife. Then he caught a glimpse of himself in the backstage mirror. He stared at his reflection, the purple hair, the leather jacket, and the smug look on his face that he had worn as a shield for so long. The man in the mirror wasn't him anymore. He was just a puppet who danced for Tony's cruel amusement, a shell of what he thought was progressive and enlightened. And right then, Garrett realized the truth. He was a fucking joke. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his best friend, or as Garrett called them, his emotional support activist. Dude, saw the set. I don't know if Tony was punching down or just making sure you don't forget your place in the world. I love your dedication to activism, though. Keep fighting the good fight. Never let them make you feel small. Garrett, still seething, almost smashed the phone against the wall, but stopped himself. He could feel the weight of his newfound self-awareness pulling him under, but there was still a part of him that wanted to fight. It was the part of him that refused to believe that a room full of strangers, some of whom probably couldn't even spell intersectionality, could reduce him to a crumbling mess of existential dread. That part of him wanted to scream at the top of his lungs, but instead, he just typed back a reply. Thanks, man. I think it went well. I'm pretty sure I changed the world tonight. He stared at the message for a moment, then realized just how pathetic it sounded, like a defeated warrior pretending he wasn't lying to himself. He didn't even hit send. A voice interrupted his internal battle. Garrett! It was the host of the show, Tony's sidekick, Brian. You coming out for the post-show, or are you going to cry in the green room like a little bitch? Garrett didn't even try to respond. He just stood there, frozen, staring at the mirror as the self-inflicted mental wound started to bleed. His body was telling him to leave, to go home and never speak of this night again, but the cold realization hit him like a punch in the gut. He wasn't leaving. He was part of the story now. And the story was getting darker. Back in the studio, the audience was still buzzing, a mix of clapping and light chatter filling the air. They didn't give a shit about Garret, not really. He wasn't a hero or a villain to them. He was just some idiot who came to the show thinking he could lecture people about morality, only to get flattened by the weight of his own ridiculousness. He was the clown that they would remember for 5 minutes before moving on to the next one, but the sting of the night would stick with him long after the credits rolled. All right, next up, Tony called out, moving on to the next victim. Garret stood there in the wings, the absurdity of his situation slowly sinking in. He wasn't a victim. He was a fucking punchline. As the next comedian took the stage, Garret let out a hollow laugh, a sound that echoed inside his skull like a death rattle. A couple of people in the crowd glanced over at him, some smirking, some genuinely feeling sorry for him. But Garret didn't care. Not anymore. The damage was done. The joke had been made, and he was the punchline. Look at this guy. One of the audience members whispered, probably trying to gauge how much more pain they could extract from Garret's shredded ego. What's with the hair, man? Is he in a fucking metal band or a midlife crisis? Garret turned to face them, his eyes narrowed. He was done being the nice guy, done being the woke guy who thought he could change the world with his purple hair and self-righteousness. That version of him was gone. In that moment, he realized that nothing about him had been authentic. It was all just a performance, a costume. Yeah, he muttered, his voice low and venomous. I'm in a metal band called Life's Bitch, and you're all the fucking background noise. The person who had whispered, Garret stumbled off stage, his dignity. Garret's footsteps echoed down the dimly lit alley as he moved away from the club, his leather jacket creaking with each step. He could feel the cold air slicing through the fabric, but it was nothing compared to the internal chill that had settled in his bones. He tried to shake it off, but the burn of humiliation lingered in his chest, like a tattoo he couldn't scrub off. His phone buzzed again. Yo, Garret, you good? It was from his activist friend again. The same one who had cheered him on from the sidelines, never once questioning if maybe, just maybe, Garret had spent the last few years living in a bubble where everything that wasn't woke was a personal attack. He snorted and thumbed a reply, his fingers moving fast. Just got off stage. Tony said I should write a book about how to bomb gracefully. Lol? He didn't wait for the response. He just shoved the phone back in his pocket, hoping the message wouldn't somehow come back to haunt him, because at this point, nothing he said or did could dig him out of the hole he'd just dug himself into. The night was cold, but not as cold as the void that had opened up inside him. He walked aimlessly, letting his feet guide him through the city, not really caring where he went. It was after a few blocks of aimless wandering when the familiar neon lights of a 24-hour diner appeared in the distance, flickering like the last vestiges of his dignity. His stomach growled, but he wasn't sure if he was hungry for food or just something, anything, to distract him from the crushing weight of his thoughts. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and the smell of greasy fries and burnt coffee hit him like a punch in the face. It felt like the kind of place where every booth was filled with a sad story, where everyone was just a little bit broken, and no one was pretending to be anything else. Garret slid into a booth in the back, trying to melt into the shadowed corner. A waitress with a name tag that read Shannon walked over, her expression neutral, like she had seen it all before. You good? She asked, her voice flat but not unkind. Garret looked at her, trying to muster something that resembled a smile. I don't know. You ever bomb so hard that you question everything about your life? Shannon didn't blink. She leaned over and placed the menu in front of him. We all bomb sometimes. You want the usual? Garret stared at the menu for a second, then nodded. Yeah, same thing as last time. As Shannon walked away, Garret looked around the diner. The hum of the fluorescent lights was like a slow, relentless torture. The clink of plates, the scrape of silverware against ceramic, it all blended into one constant, numbing sound. His mind kept looping back to the show, to the moment when he thought he had something important to say, only to be drowned out by a room full of laughter. But then something snapped in him. He wasn't going to let this define him. He refused to let that one night on stage be the story of his life. The waitress returned with his food, a sad-looking plate of greasy hash browns, eggs, and toast that looked like it had been slapped together by someone who was just trying to make it through their shift. Garret didn't care. He dug in, the food heavy and tasteless in his mouth, but at least it was something. And as he chewed, a thought occurred to him, something he had buried deep in his brain but couldn't escape. Maybe he wasn't supposed to be the good guy. Maybe he wasn't the hero of the story he kept telling himself. Maybe he was the punchline all along. He pushed the plate away, suddenly not hungry anymore. He wiped his mouth with the napkin, but his thoughts kept swirling around like a cyclone of regret and anger. He was still that guy, wasn't he? The one who wore his wokeness like a badge, pretending to be above it all while secretly hoping for validation from everyone around him. It wasn't the world that needed fixing. It was him. It was then that the door to the diner opened with a loud creak, and in walked a group of people, another pack of late-night wanderers, probably a bunch of comedians looking to drown their egos in coffee. Garret recognized a few of them from the show, and his gut tightened in the familiar way it had all night. The world was small, and it wasn't done laughing at him. They made their way to the counter, and one of them, some guy who looked like he lived in a black t-shirt, spotted Garret sitting alone in his booth. "Oh, look! It's Mr. Purple Hair himself! How's the soul-crushing defeat going?" The guy called out, smirking. Garret's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. Instead, he took a deep breath, looking down at his empty plate. His fingers twitched, and for a brief second, he considered going full meltdown mode, throwing his drink in their faces, screaming until the walls cracked. Garret was back. He'd spent the entire night pacing around the city like a dog with too much caffeine in its system, replaying everything that had just happened. The snowflake mentality was peeling off of him like layers of old paint, but there was still a lingering feeling that he wasn't fully untangled from it. The world was laughing at him. And goddammit, it had been a long time since he'd had the nerve to fight back. So here he was. Standing in the wings of the Kill Tony stage, purple hair spiked just enough to look like a lazy attempt at rebellion. The black leather jacket was still there, still hanging off his shoulders like it was some kind of shield. But this time, he wasn't walking in with some pretentious moral high ground. This time, Garret was ready to get roasted. Tony Hinchcliffe stood at the helm of the madness, looking out at the crowd, his usual smug grin plastered on his face. Next up on Kill Tony, a man who thinks being offended is a personality trait. Give it up for Garret. The crowd clapped, half expecting something half-decent. Garret strolled out onto the stage like he owned it, trying to act like the fearless soldier who'd survived his own ego collapse. The harsh, unforgiving lights hit his face, but he barely flinched. He grabbed the mic like he'd been doing it for years. "So, what's up, fuckers?" he said, attempting to start strong. "I'm Garret, and I'm here to make you uncomfortable." The room was dead silent. No one laughed, no one clapped. It was like they were waiting for him to fuck up, and they wouldn't have to wait long. Casey Rocket, who had been lounging in the corner of the stage, gave him a look of utter disbelief. "Oh my God, man, you sound like a bad Netflix documentary on how to be a fucking embarrassment," he spat, his voice dripping with condescension. Garret wasn't sure whether to be offended or impressed. He opted for offended, of course. Cam Patterson, sitting across from him, leaned in with a smile that was part concern, part malicious enjoyment. "This guy looks like a rejected Power Ranger character. Did you get your costume at a gay thrift shop?" Cam laughed, shaking his head as he looked at Garret's ridiculous purple ponytail. "And that hair, man! You look like a grape that forgot it was supposed to be a raisin." The crowd chuckled, but Garret wasn't having it. He wasn't ready to back down. He shot Cam a look, but his face twisted into something almost animalistic as he stood there on the stage, glaring at the whole panel. Hans Kim, ever the sarcastic one, joined the roast with a devious grin. "You know what you look like, dude? You look like someone tried to make an edgy character for a high school play and ran out of money. Like the costume department said, 'Hey, throw on a leather jacket and some purple shit. That'll make you edgy, right?'" The audience was roaring now, but Garret wasn't laughing. He didn't like the way the tides had turned. His mask of confidence was starting to crack. David Lucas, sitting next to Hans, eyed Garret like he was the punchline to a joke that wasn't funny. "I don't even know where to start with you, dude," David said, resting his arm on the back of his chair, all the while grinning like a hungry shark. "What do you think is cool about this? The purple hair? The fake tough guy routine? You look like a fucking mall goth who's trying to sell me a used vape." Uncle Laser, the older comic with the grimy devil-may-care attitude, let out a wheeze of a laugh as he chimed in. "Nah, man, he's not a goth. He's a woke warrior who thinks he's saving the world by acting offended by every fucking joke. Look at him!" Uncle Laser mimicked Garrett's posture, pretending to hold an imaginary microphone in a pretentious way. "I'm Garret. I'm the moral compass of the internet. Every time you make a joke, I'm going to tell you how fucked up you are. Just ask my Twitter. It's full of people who care about how offended I am." The crowd exploded. Uncle Laser kept going. "Tell me, Garret, do you scream at the TV when you see something you don't like? Or do you just post long, sad rants online, hoping your opinion is going to change anyone's life?" Willem Montgomery, sitting across from Garret, gave him a look of confusion mixed with sheer pity. "Dude, you look like you came out of a fucking Van Halen music video. Like they tried to cast you as the lead singer, but then decided you were too much of a weirdo to even hang out with. How old are you, Garret? 15? You look like you're dressed for a role you haven't quite grown into yet." Garret could feel the heat of embarrassment rising in his chest, his whole body stiffening. This wasn't the comedy he was prepared for. This wasn't the safe space where his righteous anger was going to shield him. But they weren't done. The insults came faster now, a relentless machine built to break him. It was like they were playing a game, and Garret had entered their territory thinking he was the one in control. But they had already taken the microphone and wrapped it around his neck. Cam Patterson leaned in and grinned. "You ever look in the mirror, Garret, and just wonder if you're the villain in someone else's life story? Or do you just listen to your own sob stories and call it doing the work?" The audience was howling at that one. Garret couldn't hide the cringe, but the words were sticking to him now. There was no escaping it. They were right. They'd peeled him apart in front of a crowd, and he was just sitting there like an idiot with his purple hair and leather jacket, pretending to be the main character in a story that didn't exist. The Kill Tony crew wasn't finished with Garret yet. Not by a long shot. Tony, with a wicked grin plastered on his face, pulled out a gleaming golden ticket and held it up in the air like it was the most valuable thing in the universe. The crowd gasped as if they'd just seen a unicorn take a shit on stage. "Garret, you've earned yourself a golden ticket," Tony said, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "This isn't your typical fanfare. No, no, no. You, my friend, have been chosen for a special, once-in-a-lifetime experience. The kind of experience that'll change your life forever. If you survive it, that is." Garret blinked. Was this some kind of setup? He felt like a deer caught in headlights, but he couldn't back down now. He had to be tough. He had to pretend he wasn't sweating bullets on the inside. The leather jacket stuck to him like it was glued to his skin, and his purple ponytail felt like it was mocking him from the top of his head. "Where's this golden ticket taking me, Tony?" Garret asked, trying to hold on to some semblance of dignity, though it was already slipping through his fingers like sand in a hurricane. Tony leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "You, my friend, are about to get roasted to a level you can't even imagine. You're going to Madison Square Garden for episode 6969 of Kill Tony. And the best part? Shane Gillis, Big J. Okerson, and Anthony Jeselnik are waiting there for you, ready to do the thing you've been dreading your whole life. Get ready, Garret. It's gonna get dark." Garret's heart skipped a beat. Madison Square Garden? The biggest, most infamous stage in comedy history? The place where legends were made? And those three, the most brutal, savage comics in the world? He started to feel the existential dread creep in, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he'd bitten off more than he could chew. But of course, he couldn't back out now. This was his moment, right? The thing he'd been searching for his whole life, validation through suffering. Or was it just self-inflicted humiliation in front of a crowd that wanted to see him squirm? A blacked-out SUV arrived to pick him up, and he had just enough time to shove his pride into the trunk with his luggage before he was whisked away to the garden. The stage was set. The energy in the air was palpable, like the universe itself was preparing to make Garret the punchline of the greatest roast in history. Garret stood backstage, trying to pretend he wasn't shaking like a leaf in a windstorm, surrounded by the real deal. Shane Gillis, Big J. Okerson, and Anthony Jeselnik. Shane Gillis, the unfiltered genius of chaos, walked over to Garret first, sizing him up like a butcher choosing meat. "So, you're the guy who thinks people get offended because they're wronged," Shane said with that sly, smug grin of his. "You're about to learn what it means to get offended in real time, buddy. Just remember, it's not personal. It's just what happens when you try to argue with every joke you hear." Garret wanted to say something, but Shane was already walking away, laughing like a maniac. Garret felt a little piece of his soul leave his body with each step Shane took. Big J. Okerson, who had been leaning back in his chair smoking a cigarette, cut in. "Look, Garret," Big J drawled, his voice thick with amusement. "I'll be honest. I don't even know what you're about. But you came all this way to get roasted, so I guess we can give you what you want." Big J smirked. "And trust me, you're gonna want it to end. You should have stayed home, watching your TikToks, writing your think pieces about the oppressive nature of comedy. But no, you decided to get on the stage and let us turn your world into a fucking joke." The words landed like a ton of bricks. Garret felt his stomach drop. He could already feel the heat rising in his cheeks. And then, out of nowhere, Anthony Jeselnik walked up with his signature deadpan stare. "Oh, we're doing this. Fantastic. I'm gonna make this painful," Jeselnik said, his voice oozing with dark delight. "You ever think about what it's like to be a joke? To know that you're a walking target for comedy? No? Well, we're gonna change that for you, Garret." Garret's palms were sweating. This wasn't just a roast anymore. This was a dismantling. They weren't just going after his outfit or his pretentious attitude. They were about to rip his identity apart like they were peeling the layers off an onion. Garret could already feel the tears welling up in the corner of his eyes. "All right, Garret," Tony Hinchcliffe said as the lights went down, signaling the beginning of the madness. "Let's do this. It's episode 6969, The Roast of Garret. Everyone, get ready. It's going to be one hell of a ride." The lights came back on, and Garret walked to the mic like he was walking to his execution. The audience was electric, practically vibrating with anticipation. The first joke hit him like a bullet to the chest. "Garret," Shane started, "you look like you're the guy who goes into a Dunkin' Donuts and tells the barista how problematic the coffee is. Just stop. You're trying to teach people about social justice, but all you're really doing is making everyone around you uncomfortable, like a vegan at a barbecue." The audience erupted in laughter. Garret's stomach twisted. The pain was immediate, but the worst part? He couldn't even deny it. Big J chimed in next, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's the deal with your purple hair, Garret? You look like the back cover of a shitty self-help book no one's ever gonna read. How to Be Different, by the guy who just got kicked out of a hot topic." Garret wanted to crawl into a hole and never come out. But then Anthony Jeselnik, the maestro of Savage, took his turn. "Garret, I don't know what's worse. The fact that you think people care about your political opinions, or the fact that you think your opinions actually matter. You're like a pimple on the ass of the comedy world. Annoying, unnecessary, and just begging to be popped." The room went silent for a second before it erupted into uncontrollable laughter. Garret could feel every ounce of his self-worth evaporate into thin air. But they weren't done. They were only getting started. "Now, Garret," Tony said, barely holding in his laughter, "do you get it now? This is what happens when you act like you're too important to laugh at yourself. You come to kill Tony, and we show you what real comedy looks like. Welcome to the big leagues, kid." Shane Gillis gave Garret a pat on the back, almost too hard. "You're going to be great, Garret, just not in comedy." And with that, the lights dimmed and the crowd went. The madness of the roast continued, but Garret wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. No, he had one last weapon in his arsenal: his hair. Yes, his precious purple ponytail, the symbol of everything he believed in, was about to become the centerpiece of his final battle. Garret ever the martyr, decided that if the comedians weren't going to show him any mercy, he'd take the war to the only place that made sense: Twitter. As the Kill Tony episode wound down, Garrett's mind began to spin. "I'm not going to let these assholes define me," he muttered under his breath. "I'll show them that I deserve to be heard." And so he whipped out his phone and began tapping away furiously. His fingers moved with the speed and conviction of someone who'd already spent way too much time in the trenches of online arguments. This was the fight that mattered, the one where he would have control. The one where he could wage war from the comfort of his own safe space, tucked away from the relentless comedic artillery fire. The first tweet came out like a manifesto. "Just got roasted on @KillTonyShow by a bunch of washed-up, bitter comedians who think their jokes are still funny. They wouldn't know progressive comedy if it slapped them in the face. Purple hair is not a crime, it's a statement of resistance. Stand with Garret, comedy is not dead, cancel Kill Tony." Garret felt a little spark of satisfaction, like he just detonated a tiny grenade of self-righteousness. But that wasn't enough. He wasn't done yet. This needed to be bigger. This needed to be a movement. And so he kept going, tapping with the fury of 1,000 righteous Twitter warriors. For anyone who says purple hair isn't a political statement, you're part of the problem. I stand for something greater than being a punchline. Don't at me with your jokes. This is activism. Purple ponytail power. He hit send with the same pride someone might feel after solving world hunger. Garret could already taste the sweet victory of thousands of retweets and likes. He was a hero now, or so he thought. But Twitter doesn't work like that. Twitter is a fucking battlefield, and soon the replies came flooding in. First, Shane Gillis retweeted Garrett's tweet with a simple comment: "When your hair looks like Barney the dinosaur on a bender." The floodgates opened, and the world was now officially invited to roast Garret in ways he'd never imagined. Big J. Okerson chimed in next. "Purple hair doesn't mean you're woke. It means you shop at Hot Topic and have no idea how to use a razor blade." The crowd in the Madison Square Garden had already heard these jokes, but seeing them pop up on Twitter made them feel like 1,000 tiny paper cuts to Garrett's ego. Still, he doubled down. "My hair represents self-expression and individuality, you ignorant trolls. Comedy should evolve, not stay stuck in the past like your boring, stale humor. If you don't understand that, maybe you're the ones who need to be canceled. #progressive comedy." The likes and retweets began to trickle in, but they weren't from the people Garret had hoped for. Instead of a wave of support from woke Twitter, he was getting destroyed by his own tweet. Accounts like @FatCowboyJ and @CrispyComedian were mercilessly mocking him, ripping apart his sanctimonious takes like they were Thanksgiving turkeys. But the real kicker came when Garret saw the comment that made his blood run cold. Purple hair? More like purple rage. This clown is out here acting like he's the last crusader for social justice, but it's just self-pity wrapped in a hoodie and a ponytail. Uncle Laser, the absolute, Garret knew that name. Uncle Laser, the infamous wild card from Kill Tony, the one who'd made him feel small on that stage with just a single barely conscious comment about his fashion choices. Garrett's face turned crimson. His teeth ground together. He fired back quickly. "Uncle Laser? More like Uncle Low Expectations. Your jokes are so outdated, I feel like I'm watching a roast from 2011. Get with the times, Grandpa." He sat back, heart pounding, waiting for the flood of likes and retweets. He was, after all, fighting for the right cause, wasn't he? The purple ponytail was his banner, his cry for justice in a world where comedians who didn't get it were clinging to their outdated ways. But the world was laughing at him. The replies came in faster than he could keep up with. "Purple hair and a victim complex. This is the future of comedy, huh? Trash Panda 1? Honestly, the only thing progressive about your hair is the way it makes my eyes roll back into my skull." And then the crushing blow. This kid could be a walking metaphor for his own failure. Purple hair, fragile ego, and a desperate need to be seen. Welcome to the Twitter roast, pal. Sad boy purple ponytail fail. Casey Rocket, Garrett's worst nightmare. Casey had the unique ability to madness of the roast continued, but Garret wasn't ready to Garret, in a desperate attempt to reclaim what little dignity he had left, decided that enough was enough. Technology had betrayed him. The internet, with all its endless pit of ridicule, had destroyed him from the inside out, and he was done with it. He was going to disconnect, not just from Twitter, but from the entire online world. It was time for a radical change, something that would surely prove to the world that Garret was deeper than just his purple hair and endless need for validation. So, like any reasonable person in a midlife crisis would do, he walked straight into a volunteer center and signed up to work as a counselor at a special ed band camp. You know, because nothing screams personal growth like babysitting a bunch of kids who think punk rock means yelling at the top of their lungs in a public library. His theory? A fresh start. He'd work with these kids, get back to basics, and really tap into his inner self. The naive optimism was still there, lurking, but he was so far gone that he thought that this was going to fix him. The first day on the job, Garret showed up to the camp in his usual garb, black leather jacket, purple ponytail, the kind of outfit that screamed, "I'm a misunderstood soul," but also whispered, "Please notice me and tell me I'm special." He was greeted by a ragtag bunch of kids in various stages of mental and emotional disarray. But Garret, feeling superior and misunderstood, thought he had them figured out. But the reality of it? Well, that was a different story entirely. From the first session, Garret realized that his new little tribe wasn't exactly what he'd envisioned. These weren't your typical feel-good-to-help type of kids. No, this was a bunch of die-hard Republican teenagers with a penchant for Reagan quotes, questionable opinions on immigration, and an unnerving love of Rush Limbaugh. He walked into the first band practice thinking he was about to teach them the power of self-expression through music, only to find that they were belting out "God Bless America" like their lives depended on it. He tried to introduce them to some edgy punk music because, well, it was what he thought would resonate with them. He pulled out his phone, about to blast some real hardcore anthems, only to have one of the kids look at him and say, "Yo, Garret, this sounds like that noise the snowflakes make when their safe spaces get violated." Another kid chimed in, "You a liberal man? We don't want no commie propaganda up in here." Garret, completely blindsided, tried to save face. No, guys, this is, well, it's punk music. It's real rebellion, not some, conservative cheerleading stuff." They didn't even flinch. One of the kids picked up a trombone and started playing "Eye of the Tiger" as if it were the national anthem. Another started shouting, "Build the wall," mid-band practice, because, of course, that was the spirit of the camp. Garret was drowning in a sea of ignorance and blind patriotism, surrounded by these kids who thought they were rebellious just because they could recite Fox News talking points like they were gospel. And he was stuck with them. But he didn't know what was worse: the relentless barrage of political opinions, or the fact that he was now starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was the real snowflake here. This wasn't a camp about creativity or freedom. This was a camp about drilling the Pledge of Allegiance into their minds until their spines straightened into the shape of the American flag. His attempts to introduce progressive thinking were met with eye rolls and sneers. His thoughts on gender identity were met with the sharp sting of, "You're a freaking snowflake, dude." And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, the camp announced that there would be a special performance that weekend. Garret's hopes briefly lifted. Maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to shine, to show these kids the power of genuine self-expression. But when the announcement came, it was worse than he could have ever imagined. Tony Hinchcliffe was coming to perform. And he wasn't just performing as a guest. No, Tony had volunteered to perform, apparently out of the goodness of his heart, because nothing says I care about society like roasting a bunch of middle schoolers at a special ed band camp. Garret's face fell when he heard the news, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He tried to wrap his brain around it. Tony, the Tony Hinchcliffe, was going to roast him in front of these kids. And with his track record of comedy, Garret knew it was going to be brutal. Garret hadn't even realized what he was walking into. He thought Tony was some edgy comic. But this was hell. The night of the performance arrived, and Garret, barely holding on to whatever semblance of sanity he had left, sat in the back of the crowd, hoping against all odds that he'd somehow survive this ordeal. Garret kept telling himself he could just blend in, sit quietly, and maybe this would be just Garret in a desperate attempt to reclaim. The snowflake saga had reached an entirely new, absurd level. It was no longer about purple hair or Twitter spats. No, Garret had gone full throttle into the realm of desperate attention seeking. In a fit of misguided, over the top self expression, he decided to transition. But not just any transition. No, Garret, in his infinite wisdom, somehow managed to get his hands on animal hormones, the kind that were meant to, I don't know, make cattle bigger or something. So, while his transition was supposed to be a personal journey to a place of peace and self acceptance, it quickly turned into something straight out of a freak show. Garret's once dainty, ethereal body became, well, let's just say it didn't really work out the way he planned. His shoulders broadened, and his chest, oh boy, his chest began sprouting udder-like mounds. He now looked like a sad cross between a dairy cow and a confused, purple-haired man-child who just realized he'd made an irreversible mistake. But Garret wasn't done. No. He wasn't just going to quietly fade into his new, bizarre reality. He was going to fight back. After all, no one had taken him seriously at Kill Tony before, so why not show up and really make a scene this time? His mind was spinning with a cocktail of rage and humiliation, which was the perfect fuel for him to return to the Kill Tony stage. Only this time, he wasn't there to laugh. He wasn't there to roast. He was there to destroy Tony. So there he was, in his leather jacket and now puffy, uncomfortably swollen chest, stomping onto the stage, eyes red and crazed like he was about to go on a murder spree. His ponytail, now thicker and more chaotic, looked like it was battling his insane new hormones. He took the mic, his hands shaking with fake fury. "All right, Tony," he yelled, voice cracking. "I'm here to take you down. You've humiliated me long enough, you miserable piece of..." His rage, which he thought was justified, was rapidly unraveling. He choked on his words, the absurdity of the situation hitting him like a freight train. The audience was staring, confused, not knowing if they were watching a train wreck, a comedy show, or a legitimate mental breakdown. Garret took a breath, attempting to steady himself, but the tears began to well up in his eyes. He sniffled and wiped his face, not quite understanding what was happening anymore. You think you can just roast me and get away with it?" he sobbed. "You think you're the only one with a platform? You think you're the only one who can make people laugh at other people's pain?" Tony, ever the professional, gave him a look that said everything. What the hell is going on here? But Garret wasn't done. Oh no, he had to tell his story. The world had to know how hard he had it. "It's not fair," he said, voice quivering as he took a long, exaggerated pause, wiping his eyes. "Do you understand what it's like, Tony? Huh? Do you know what it's like to always be misunderstood? To always be the person people make fun of because you're different? Because you. He choked again, looking down at his swollen chest in disbelief. "I tried to be strong. I tried to do the right thing, but people just kept laughing at me. I tried to fight back. I wanted to be seen, wanted to be heard, wanted to be validated. But instead, I became a joke, a freak. Do you know what it's like to feel like you're drowning, Tony? Do you? Do you?" The crowd had gone silent. There was an odd energy in the room. No one knew how to respond. Garret's tears were flowing freely now, his face red and blotchy, his words completely disconnected from any sense of reality. He wasn't making sense anymore. He was spiraling, pouring out every last drop of his twisted, exaggerated sob story. "I just wanted to be loved, Tony. I just wanted to be accepted. Is that so much to ask? Huh? Huh?" He screamed, throwing his arms up, his voice cracking under the weight of his own insanity. Then, just as Garret thought he was on the brink of an emotional breakdown that could have rivaled any Oscar-winning performance, a voice from the back of the room interrupted. "Oh my God, shut up." Everyone turned to look, and there she was, a woman in the crowd, rolling her eyes so hard it looked like they might fall out of her head. She stood up, hands on her hips, looking at Garret with the kind of disgust usually reserved for someone who's just wiped their dog's shit on the carpet. "Jesus Christ, you're pathetic." Garret froze, the words stinging more than anything Tony could have said. The woman wasn't done. "You're out here making a scene, crying like a little bitch, and you still think you're special. Newsflash, pal, you're not. You're just a guy with purple hair and an identity crisis the size of your inflated ego. I've seen more authenticity in a wet paper towel than whatever the hell you're trying to pull here. The crowd began to murmur, some laughing, others shaking their heads. But Garret felt the cold, brutal truth hit him like a ton of bricks. For a moment, it felt like the air had been sucked. The snowflake saga had. Garrett's hormones had taken him on a trip so twisted, even he didn't see it coming. The once innocent attempt to find himself through his transition and pathetic outbursts at Kill Tony had morphed into something so bizarre, so mind-numbingly chaotic, that it might as well have been written by some sadistic, deranged screenwriter who only fed off the suffering of others. After walking off that stage, Garrett's life became a dark, twisted parody of everything he claimed to stand for. The hormones? Yeah, they weren't just messing with his body anymore. They were wrecking his mind in ways that could only be described as apocalyptic. His chest was now undeniably larger than most bodybuilders, and instead of the dainty, delicate figure he thought he'd have, Garret looked like a steroid-abusing mutant cow from hell. It wasn't even the physical changes that were the worst part. No, the real horror was the mental game the hormones were playing on him. His brain was no longer his. Garrett's mind had been taken over by some twisted, primal version of himself, an emotionally unhinged version of the feminist, purple-haired, soy-drinking little boy who thought the world owed him something. He couldn't even go online anymore without having full-on emotional meltdowns. Twitter, once his self-affirming safe space, had become the battleground for the worst of his delusions. His followers were starting to lose their patience, and Garret, in a last-ditch attempt to reclaim his sense of purpose, did what any rational human would do in his position. He announced his official transition to being an ex-human. That's right, Garret decided that the hormonal chaos was the fault of humanity itself. It wasn't him. No, he was evolving. According to him, humans weren't equipped to understand his higher level of being, and if they couldn't get on board with that, well, he was done with them. He was done being a part of this system. He posted a video on TikTok, a wild, deranged 2-minute rant that felt like a fever dream with the sound of broken glass playing in the background. His face was red, his ponytail had grown into a full-on mess of purple madness, and his shirt was too tight for him to even take a breath. I'm done. Done with this flesh. Done with this world. You want to make me a freak? Fine. You want me to be your little joke? Fine, but you can't silence me anymore. You can't take away my voice. I've ascended, and I'm no longer a part of your human race. The video was a fucking disaster. His followers were horrified, watching this unhinged, hyper-aggressive freak lose it on the internet, promising them he would no longer be human. It was a train wreck wrapped in purple leather, and everyone knew it. And that's when the unthinkable happened. In his quest to transcend humanity, Garret made the fateful decision to go full animal. He wasn't going to just be a gender-confused snowflake. No, no, no. He was going to become something else entirely. A beast. He tweeted it out loud and proud. My transformation is complete. From this day forward, I am no longer bound by your human rules. I am a proud goat. Goat energy, baby. To anyone reading, it was a sentence filled with insanity. But to Garret, this was his crowning moment. His big fuck you to society. A few days later, Garret showed up at a Kill Tony taping again, but this time he was an entirely different monster. Literally. He was wearing a full-on goat costume. Not even a good one either. It was a knockoff from some shitty online store. His face was painted to look like a goat, his udder-like chest stuffed into a weird, half-ripped latex bodysuit that made him look more like an overcooked hot dog than a transformed spiritual being. As he stood backstage before walking out in front of the crowd, Garret felt that familiar rage well up inside him. The hormones, the anger, the need for attention. It was all mixing together into something dangerously combustible. His goat horns, which were, for some reason, made of pool noodles, poked out awkwardly, and the fake fur on his arms was itching like hell. But that didn't matter. He stomped onto the stage, the audience collectively gasped, and Tony Hinchcliffe, who had long since stopped being surprised by anything, simply stared at Garret. The absurdity of the situation hit him like a 2x4. Garret gripped the microphone, his trembling hands making it look like he was trying to strangle it. You think you've seen it all, Tony? Huh? You think you've seen me? Garret screamed, his voice cracking like a prepubescent version of a demon on a bender. You have no idea what's coming. I'm not just a man. I'm not just a snowflake. I'm a fucking goat now. The crowd was silent for a moment. Everyone was trying to process what was happening. A man, a purple-haired, hormone-driven man-child in a goat costume, was yelling about being a goat. The absurdity was so thick, it was Garret's downward spiral hit new levels of grotesque absurdity, so dark and twisted it might as well have been written by a deranged circus clown with a Twitter account. After his ill-fated attempt at self-transformation into a goat, he decided to take a break from being a hormone-crazed farm animal and get back into his bread and butter, attention-seeking. But this time, Garret had a new weapon in his arsenal. An article. Oh yes, this article would change the world. Or at least, that's what he told himself as he sat in his poorly lit basement, tapping away on his keyboard like a confused toddler with too many feelings and too much free time. The article was titled, "The New Era of Human Expression: Why Gay Men Should Call Their Butts Pussies, and Why You Should Call It a Bussy." The sheer audacity was staggering. Garrett's entire thought process was basically, if the world isn't acknowledging how fucking enlightened I am, I'll just make up my own language. It wasn't just that he thought this would be groundbreaking. It was as if he believed the world had been holding its breath for this hot, steaming pile of brain rot to land. So he went ahead and dropped that bussy bomb, hoping it would launch him into the stratosphere of online validation. But reality, as always, had other plans. The backlash was immediate and savage. Garret was torn to shreds by every corner of the internet. The phrase butt pussy spread like wildfire, and it wasn't because people loved it. It was because they were so disgusted by it that they couldn't look away. The online comments were brutal. Is this real life? Or did we all just collectively enter some twisted episode of Black Mirror? Yo, I think this is the worst thing I've ever read, and I read a lot of "you won't believe what happened next" stories on Reddit. Garrett's article was roasted harder than a Thanksgiving turkey, with a side of savage comments. The online world decided that this was the moment they'd collectively cancel Garrett's existence. In fact, it was so bad that his article got more traction than any of his past attempts at self-expression. People weren't just rejecting him, they were laughing at him with such glee it almost looked like a mob at a public execution. The term bussy trended, but not because anyone was embracing it. No, it was the world laughing in perfect harmony at Garrett's expense. But Garret? Oh, he doubled down like an absolute idiot. With all the grace of a flaming dumpster barreling down a hill, Garret got his golden ticket to redemption, an invite to kill Tony. There he was, back in the spotlight, stage lights blaring down on him like an unforgiving spotlight on a lost child who didn't know what the hell he was doing. He took that golden ticket and clutched it like a man who was about to face the gallows but still thought he was the star of the show. Garret was ready to own the stage. He strolled up to the mic with the air of a deluded king, purple hair flowing, or rather, clinging in greasy clumps, as he adjusted his fake fur vest like he was auditioning for a role in Furry the Musical. The crowd was already giving him the side eye. The energy was thick, and not in a good way. More like a wall of thick, stinky dread. This was going to be something to witness. Everyone was on edge, waiting to see how far Garret would take his self-destructive plunge. Spoiler, he was going to take it all the way. Ladies and gentlemen, Garret began, his voice already sounding like a dying sheep's final bleat. I've come here to speak my truth. I know what you all think. Oh, there goes the purple-haired soy boy again, talking about bussy. He paused dramatically, soaking up non-existent applause. But I need you to understand, it's not just about the bussy, it's about freedom. And I need you all to acknowledge that sometimes, a man's butt can become a pussy. Do you understand? The crowd froze. People shifted awkwardly in their seats, eyes darting around as if to make sure they hadn't just accidentally stumbled into some bizarre fever dream. And for the record, Garret added, I want you all to call me Little Pig Wee Wee Boy. That's my name now. Yeah, it's a revolution of love and boundaries and cuddles. He finished the sentence with a smug, half-winking look, as if anyone was on board with the shitstorm he was spewing. The room was silent, uncomfortably silent. No one knew how to react. This wasn't comedy. This wasn't even performance art. This was just a man slowly, painfully unspooling in front of a live audience. Then it got worse. Garret, looking like a deranged version of someone who just walked out of a petting zoo on bath salts, started to ramble in rhymes. Liberal talk, like some sort of half-mad political poet, mixed with nonsensical guttural bleats that seemed to suggest he'd completely lost all connection to reality. I'm not just a sheep. I'm a warrior for change. I'll make you all see that freedom ain't so strange. I stand for the bussy and the little pig ways, but I need you all to stop and hear what I say. He bleated louder, voice cracking, almost like a middle schooler trying to rap. You gotta break free from your cis-het chains, or you'll never understand the world of my brains. At that moment, it was clear. Garret wasn't just gone. He was lost. His identity had morphed into some surreal fever dream, an amalgamation of extreme ideologies, animal hormones, and an unhealthy obsession with being a victim of everything. The crowd at Kill Tony sat there for a moment, utterly stunned by the unrelenting wreckage that had just unfolded on stage. Garret's exit was as graceful as a falling tree. Only the tree had been on fire and was screaming about freedom and bussy. The whole room waited, like a group of people at a dinner party that just watched someone accidentally eat a live cockroach. No one knew what the hell just happened, but they couldn't look away. Tony Hinchcliffe, ever the sadistic professional, adjusted his mic, smirking like a cat that just knocked a glass off the counter and was pretending it didn't know how it happened. Ladies and gentlemen, Tony began, his voice dripping with the same mockery that would make even a saint reconsider their faith. That right there was an absolute masterclass in how not to exist. The crowd erupted, half in relief, half in discomfort, like they'd just witnessed a car crash where the car had somehow caught fire, taken out a streetlight, and killed everyone's hopes for good comedy in one fell swoop. Tony continued, his face lighting up with the kind of schadenfreude that could power a small country. I gotta tell ya, I've never seen someone melt down that hard in my life, he said, pointing at Garret's retreating figure. That was some next-level, basement-dwelling, hormone-fueled lunacy that should have its own Netflix special called What Happens When Your Entire Personality is Made of Twitter Arguments. As the audience laughed, Garret, poor Garret, was lost in the back. His mind was still spinning, like an angry hamster on an endless wheel, desperate to justify his existence in a world that had clearly given up on him. He was in the midst of a complete identity crisis, too deep in the throes of whatever social conscious shitstorm he was trying to pass off as self-discovery. He thought he was some kind of revolutionary, when really he was just a guy who'd lost the plot entirely and traded in his sense of reality for a ridiculously overused hashtag. Backstage, Garret was already tweeting furiously, like he had just discovered an ancient treasure map written in hashtags and hashtags alone. He posted, "I'm being canceled for being brave. For speaking the truth, the media's not ready for my bussy revolution. The liberals will never understand." If only he'd known that his mentions were just full of angry people asking him how he could claim to be woke while literally disintegrating into a puddle of hormones and utter confusion. Meanwhile, Tony wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. He had just gotten started. As Garret's self-inflicted disaster became the talk of the night, Tony had already moved on to a much better subject, roasting the living hell out of Garret from behind the safety of his mic. That guy, Tony said, probably spent 3 weeks writing that article. 3 weeks. Imagine all the brain cells that died while he was typing the word bussy over and over again. Those poor neurons. I bet they're sitting in a corner, filing for unemployment right now. Then came a wild curveball. Garret, ever the glutton for punishment, decided that the only way to reclaim his dignity would be to go back to his roots. He didn't need the stage. He just needed attention. But this time, he doubled down on his absurdity. This time, Garret was going to show the world just how far he could take his humiliation. But this wasn't just another appearance on Kill Tony. No, this time, Garret was bringing the fight to them. He was going to storm the stage in all his hormone-inflated, hormone-crazed, sheep-riding glory. This time, there was no holding back. Garret took a deep breath, the kind of breath you take when you know your future is about to be the greatest punchline in the history of mankind. His grand plan? To transition again. But this time, it was all about identity, a new kind of self. The world wasn't ready for it, Garret claimed. He wasn't just a sheep anymore. He was about to turn into something bigger. His next grand revelation? He was going to become a full-on kangaroo. Because why not, right? It's not like his prior decisions made any sense to begin with. And this is where things really started to get ugly. Garret showed up at the next Kill Tony taping, dressed in what can only be described as a hideous creature cosplay version of a kangaroo. He had on an oversized onesie, and he carried around a fake pouch that had his emotional support baby bottle hanging from it like a badge of honor. The entire outfit made him look like an insane person who had walked off the set of a terrible children's movie about gender fluidity and farm animals. The second he stepped foot on stage, the audience could barely contain themselves. Garret was not just a laughingstock anymore. He was now a caricature of every millennial meltdown anyone had ever seen. Tony was almost speechless, but only for a second. He grabbed his mic and pointed directly at Garret's inflatable pouch and said, "What is that, buddy? Is that your bussy? Or are you just glad to see us? Because, it really does look like you brought your own kangaroo-sized problems tonight." The crowd was howling. Garret, still somehow oblivious to the fact that he was the literal embodiment of every bad decision ever made, started angrily screaming about freedom, choice, and how no one understood the emotional weight of his journey. He started ranting about animal hormones again and how he felt more alive than ever before. He didn't even know what to say anymore. He had crossed every boundary, peeled back every layer of personal dignity, and thrown it all into the fire. He was now a walking, talking meme, and he didn't even realize it. The final moment of Garret's journey came when he decided that the audience wasn't hearing his pain. He climbed up onto a table in the middle of the stage and dramatically collapsed into a pool of fake tears, crying about his transition into a kangaroo and how no one understood his fight. The crowd was on the floor, laughing so hard that it almost looked like some kind of surreal, horrifying fever dream. And just as Garret was sobbing about his internal kangaroo struggle, Tony grabbed his mic, looked at him, and deadpanned. "Buddy, I gotta tell you, at this point, you're just one bad decision away from being a full-time reality show on TLC. I mean, what are you gonna do next? Transform into a rock?" Garret's sobs were drowned out by the roar of the audience, and in that moment, Garret realized maybe, just maybe, he had gone too far. But who were we kidding? He'd been too far gone for years. The roar of the audience in the studio was nothing short of apocalyptic. Garret was still sprawled out on the floor, clutching his fake pouch as though it held the last shred of dignity he had left. Spoiler alert, it didn't. His hysterics were so over the top, they could have been a scene from a tragicomic play, except the audience was loving it in that we can't believe this is happening, but we can't look away kind of way. Tony Hinchcliffe, smirking like the predator he was, leaned over to the mic. "Oh, Garret, you're a special kind of special, aren't you?" he said, each word dripping with venom and amusement. "The only thing you've transitioned into is the laughingstock of a generation that hasn't yet figured out how to breathe correctly. And now, here you are, a fucking kangaroo." The crowd lost it. Even the diehard fans were starting to think that maybe they'd accidentally wandered into a bizarre art exhibit for emotional train wrecks. But Garret? Garret didn't get it. He was in the middle of something grand, something monumental. The world would understand, damn it. He was making a statement. And then, in the most insanely bad idea anyone had ever had, Garret tried to stand up, but instead of pulling himself together like a semi-responsible human being, he launched into the wildest, most self-sabotaging speech of his already self-sabotaged life. I am transcending," Garret shouted, his voice cracking like a dying violin string. I am more than a kangaroo. I am a warrior for change. I am the voice of the marginalized, the voiceless. I am the bussy revolution, and I'll be damned if the world doesn't accept my journey into self-liberation." The audience was half laughing, half crying, unsure if this was real life or if they'd slipped into a collective fever dream. But Garret, he didn't care. He was free. Free to ruin every last semblance of his reputation for a fleeting moment of validation from a room full of people who had, by now, all hope in him ever being more than a walking circus act. Tony was quick to capitalize on the train wreck. Yeah, Garret, you're right. You're definitely a warrior for the world's most fucked up reality show, he said, eyes gleaming like a sadistic hunter watching his prey stumble into its own demise. But I gotta ask, who is gonna pick up your bussy when you're done making out with your own reflection in the mirror of your tragic existence? 'Cause last I checked, no one's coming to rescue you from this mess. The crowd exploded in laughter, the kind of laughter that only comes from the purest form of schadenfreude, the pleasure you get from someone else's absolute and total destruction. But then, in the grandest twist of all, Garret, still on the floor like a victim of a particularly brutal game of Jenga, turned his gaze upward with eyes that were just a little too wild for comfort. You all just don't get it, okay? He yelled, sounding like a rabid animal that had somehow learned how to talk. I'm an enigma, a trailblazer. You want to laugh at me? Fine. But one day, I'll be remembered for breaking free of the gender binary, for expanding the idea of what it means to be human. This kangaroo, I'm the future of humanity. And I'll make sure my legacy lives on, even if you all have to watch me die from a slow mental breakdown on Instagram Live. At that point, Tony had the decency to pretend to pity Garret. Jesus, dude, you've been mentally breaking down so long, they're thinking about putting your documentary on the National Geographic Channel. The audience howled. Garret was now like a man who had accidentally burned his house down and then tried to claim it was part of an avant-garde art installation. No one knew where to look, but no one could look away. And just when it couldn't get any worse for Garret, the worst possible scenario unfolded. In the wings of the stage, behind the curtains, came the guest of the night, Shane Gillis. Now, for anyone who doesn't know Shane, he's like the tornado that sweeps through the junkyard of all things politically incorrect. And in that moment, he had the unholy pleasure of witnessing Garret's catastrophe. Shane grinned as he took the mic, and if looks could kill, Garret would have been dead on the spot. Shane wasted no time. Garret, buddy, let me get this straight. You transitioned into a kangaroo to prove you're woke? That's like saying, hey, I've got an open mind, while simultaneously shoving your head up your ass. You're the fucking reason people get confused by the term gender fluid, because you've created this circus where the lions are all cuddly and the trapeze artist is in a full meltdown. And then, the moment we'd all been waiting for. Garret's mental collapse reached its peak. He snapped. For real this time. Standing up with trembling hands, he shouted, I am an intellectual. You guys just don't understand. I'm like, the roar of the audience in the studio was nothing short of apocalyptic. Garret was still sprawled out on the floor, clutching his fake pouch as though it held the last shred of dignity he had left. Spoiler alert, it didn't. His hysterics were so over the top, they could have been a scene from a tragicomic play, except the audience was loving it in that we can't believe this is happening, but we can't look away kind of way. Tony Hinchcliffe, smirking like the predator he was, leaned over to the mic. Oh, Garret, you're a special kind of special, aren't you? He said, each word dripping with venom and amusement. The only thing you've transitioned into is the laughingstock of a generation that hasn't yet figured out how to breathe correctly. And now, here you are, a fucking kangaroo. The crowd lost it. Even the diehard fans were starting to think that maybe they'd accidentally wandered into a bizarre art exhibit for emotional train wrecks. But Garret? Garret didn't get it. He was in the middle of something grand, something monumental. The world would understand, damn it. He was making a statement. And then, in the most insanely bad idea anyone had ever had, Garret tried to stand up, but instead of pulling himself together like a semi-responsible human being, he launched into the wildest, most Garret, the walking social media meltdown wrapped in purple hair and a leather jacket, had finally reached his inevitable end. It wasn't a riot, a canceling, or even a public shaming that did him in. No, It was a kale salad. This wasn't just any kale. This was artisanal, organic, free-range kale, grown by a tribe of Instagram influencers in a greenhouse powered by the tears of self-righteous vegans. Garret had been going on and on about the healing properties of kale for months, preaching its virtues as if it were the second coming of Christ, the Messiah of the gastrointestinal tract. He even made a TikTok series about how it could detox your soul. People laughed, mostly because they were too busy shoving cheese-stuffed crust pizza into their faces to listen. But Garret wasn't just dabbling in kale. Oh no, this wasn't a casual salad-eating phase. This was full-on kale cult status. He was drinking kale smoothies like they were a sacred elixir, wiping his face with kale leaves after every meal, and claiming he could feel the cellular alignment happening as he chewed. He even had kale-infused bath salts for his rituals. His house smelled like a high-end vegan grocery store on a bad trip. One fateful afternoon, while proudly consuming an entire bowl of kale as if he were channeling the spirit of some enlightened vegan guru, Garret had an epiphany. He could feel the kale working its magic. His cells were thriving, his aura was glowing, and everything was aligning in a way that felt too good to be true. But it was. Because not even kale, in all its leafy glory, could save him from the fate he had signed up for. Within hours, Garret's system couldn't handle the self-righteous flood of nutrients. The kale took him out in the most poetic and absurd way possible. His digestive system revolted, as if saying, "Dude, you were supposed to eat a burger, not perform some kind of spiritual cleanse with your food." This is what happens when you mess with the laws of nature. You can't vegan your way out of a life you've spent ruining. Garret went into full kale-induced shock, his insides rearranging themselves like a recycling bin of half-eaten salad. His stomach churned in ways that could only be described as cataclysmic. As he collapsed onto the floor, clutching his stomach in a tragic, kale-induced final act of self-destruction. He didn't die, but let's just say that by the end of it, Garret wouldn't be able to look at a leafy green vegetable the same way ever again. And so, the man who once fought for social justice, transitioned into every identity under the sun, ranted about the downfall of society on Twitter, and became an accidental symbol of self-sabotage, met his maker at the hands of something as innocent as a salad. The world moved on, as it always does, and Garret's tragic death by kale became another bizarre footnote in the endless story of internet train wrecks, a symbol of how sometimes the biggest threat isn't a Twitter mob, a bad take, or a poorly timed meme. It's the kale you so proudly claimed would change your life. Now, somewhere out there, a pack of cows are probably just living their best lives, munching grass without a care in the world, completely unaware that their revenge was served in the form of one purple-haired vegan's untimely digestive nightmare. And that's the tragic, ridiculous, and utterly absurd tale of Garret, the self-destructive snowflake, who was taken out not by a cancel mob or a viral joke, but by kale.